Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something that will make you question everything you thought you knew about ancient Egypt. Picture this. You're the most powerful ruler on earth, surrounded by gold, worshipped as a god, yet every single night you're paralyzed with terror about what might happen when you close your eyes. She was found clutching protective amulets so tightly they left permanent marks on her palms, but why would a pharaoh be more afraid of sleep than death itself? In the next few minutes, you'll discover the shocking truth about how ancient Egyptian rulers spent their nights in absolute terror, and by the end of this journey, you'll understand why some pharaohs literally died from exhaustion rather than risk falling asleep. Here's what's going to blow your mind. While we think of pharaohs as fearless god-kings, archaeological evidence shows they were actually some of the most anxious insomniacs in human history. But here's where it gets really twisted. The very rituals designed to protect them during sleep were so elaborate and terrifying that they often caused more nightmares than they prevented. You probably won't survive hearing about the crocodile dung they rubbed on their eyelids, but we'll get to that delightful detail soon enough. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is. I love seeing our global bedtime community come together. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Standing in the Valley of the Kings 3,000 years ago, you feel the desert temperature plummet as darkness swallows the limestone cliffs. Somewhere in this ancient landscape, a pharaoh begins the most treacherous part of his day, preparing for sleep. Unlike your casual bedtime routine of checking social media, this ruler must orchestrate a symphony of supernatural protection, because in ancient Egypt, sleep wasn't merely rest, it was a nightly expedition into the realm of the dead. Mainstream historical records confirm that ancient Egyptians obsessed over the afterlife. But here's the quirky detail your textbooks omitted. They genuinely believed that every time you dozed off, your soul physically departed your body and journeyed through the underworld. Envision attempting peaceful slumber while convinced your spirit was about to face judgment from Anubis and potentially become dinner for Ammit, a crocodile-headed demon with an appetite for unworthy souls. Observing the evening preparations, you watch servants ignite specific incense combinations, frankincense blended with myrrh, and something reeking suspiciously of charred hair. The pharaoh's sleeping chamber defies your expectations of luxury. Instead, it resembles a supernatural fortress engineered to repel otherworldly threats. Hieroglyphic spells blanket every wall surface, while furniture placement follows astronomical calculations that would humble modern astrologers. Historians still argue whether these elaborate sleep preparations reflected genuine religious conviction or sophisticated psychological coping mechanisms for ruling an empire. What remains undisputed is that the average pharaoh invested more time preparing for sleep than most contemporary people spend actually sleeping. The delicious irony? The ancient world's most powerful individuals were kept awake by their own authority. During this nightly ritual, you notice the pharaoh's hands trembling slightly as he reaches for his protective amulet collection. This transcends ceremonial performance. This represents authentic terror. Divine responsibility's crushing weight, combined with legitimate political threats and a religious framework that transformed every dream into potential doomed prophecy, created a perfect storm of bedtime anxiety that makes your worst Sunday's scaries seem trivial. Servants now arrange small clay figures around the sleeping area, shabby dolls intended to serve the pharaoh in the afterlife, though tonight they function as supernatural bodyguards. Ancient Egyptians' sleep anxiety reached such extremes that some rulers employed professional dream watchers, priests whose sole responsibility involved monitoring the pharaoh's facial expressions during sleep to interpret any signs of divine communication or supernatural attack. Archaeological evidence from royal tombs reveals that pharaohs often slept with dozens of protective items within arm's reach. Golden scarab beetles, carved ivory wands depicting protective deities, and small papyrus scrolls containing personalized spells against nightmares. One particularly neurotic pharaoh, Amenhotep III, reportedly required his sleeping chamber to be blessed by 7 different priests every single night, a process that took nearly 2 hours to complete. The psychological toll of this nightly terror campaign was devastating. Medical papyri from the period describe symptoms we'd recognize today as chronic insomnia, anxiety disorders, and what might have been early forms of PTSD. Royal physicians prescribed increasingly bizarre remedies from drinking wine mixed with ground pearls to sleeping on beds carved from specific types of wood believed to repel evil spirits. Consider the absurdity. Rulers who commanded armies, built monuments that still inspire awe today, and governed millions of subjects, reduced to quivering anxiety by the simple act of closing their eyes. If ancient Egyptians had invented modern sleep aids, world history might have unfolded very differently indeed. Royal sleeping chambers weren't just bedrooms, they were architectural marvels designed as supernatural fortresses against the forces of darkness. Walking through the corridors leading to a pharaoh's private quarters, you'd immediately notice how different these spaces felt from the grand public halls. Every doorway was positioned to align with specific constellations, creating what ancient architects called star paths, that supposedly guided benevolent spirits while confusing malevolent ones. The mainstream historical fact about Egyptian architecture focuses on pyramids and temples, but here's the fascinating detail most people miss. Royal bedrooms were actually the most heavily fortified rooms in any palace, not against human intruders, but against supernatural ones. Thick limestone walls contained hidden chambers filled with protective statues, while secret passages allowed priests to perform protective rituals without disturbing the sleeping pharaoh. Ceiling designs in these chambers tell a remarkable story of paranoia and protection. Rather than simple decorative patterns, you're looking up at intricate star maps that served as navigation guides for the pharaoh's soul during its nightly journey through the underworld. Golden inlays traced the path of Ra's solar bark, while silver threads marked safe routes past dangerous demons. Imagine trying to fall asleep while staring at what was essentially a roadmap through hell. Floor layouts followed equally complex supernatural logic. Tiles weren't arranged for aesthetic appeal but according to sacred geometry that supposedly created protective energy fields. Certain patterns were believed to trap evil spirits in geometric loops, while others channeled positive energy toward the sleeping area. Walking across these floors, you'd notice subtle vibrations not from modern technology, but from carefully calculated acoustic properties that amplified protective chants while dampening threatening sounds. Historians still argue whether these architectural features were purely religious or incorporated genuine understanding of psychology and acoustics. Recent archaeological discoveries suggest that some design elements actually did create measurably calming environments, though whether this was intentional or coincidental remains debated. doorway thresholds deserve special attention because they represented the most vulnerable points in the supernatural defense system. Each entrance featured multiple layers of protection, carved hieroglyphic spells, inlaid precious metals forming protective symbols, and hidden compartments containing powerful amulets. Some thresholds were so elaborate that crossing them required specific rituals. You couldn't simply walk into a pharaoh's bedroom like entering a modern hotel room. Ventilation systems in these chambers were masterpieces of both engineering and supernatural planning. Air shafts weren't just functional. They were designed to carry protective incense throughout the room while preventing evil spirits from entering through these openings. Complex baffle systems created air currents that supposedly confused supernatural entities while ensuring the pharaoh received fresh air infused with protective fragrances. Lighting arrangements reflected deep understanding of how darkness affected the human psyche. Rather than relying on simple oil lamps, royal chambers featured sophisticated systems of mirrors and polished metal surfaces that distributed light evenly, eliminating the dark corners where evil spirits might hide. Bronze reflectors positioned at specific angles created gentle, consistent illumination that modern sleep researchers would recognize as conducive to relaxation. Storage areas within these chambers housed the pharaoh's extensive collection of sleep-related protective items. Built-in niches held hundreds of amulets, each designed for specific types of supernatural threats. Larger compartments contained backup bedding blessed by different priests, alternative pillow arrangements for various astronomical conditions, and emergency supplies of protective herbs and oils. Water features appeared in many royal sleeping chambers, not for luxury but for spiritual cleansing. Small fountains or basins allowed for pre-sleep purification rituals, while the sound of flowing water was believed to mask the pharaoh's breathing from listening demons. These weren't Instagram-worthy spa features, they were essential components of a comprehensive supernatural defense system. Temperature control in these chambers involved more than physical comfort. Specific temperature ranges were believed to be optimal for soul travel, while certain heating and cooling methods supposedly attracted or repelled different types of spirits. Braziers burned particular combinations of woods and herbs, creating not just warmth but protective atmospheric conditions. Construction materials themselves carried supernatural significance. Limestone blocks were quarried only during specific lunar phases, while wooden elements came from trees that had been blessed by temple priests. Gold leaf wasn't applied for decoration but because the metal was believed to repel certain types of demons. Silver inlays served similar protective functions, creating a complex web of metallic barriers against supernatural intrusion. Acoustic engineering in these chambers was remarkably sophisticated. Walls were designed to amplify whispered prayers while muffling external sounds that might disturb the pharaoh's sleep. Some chambers featured echo chambers that allowed priests in adjacent rooms to monitor the pharaoh's breathing patterns and detect signs of supernatural attack. The psychological effect of sleeping in such an acoustically controlled environment must have been both comforting and deeply unsettling. Furniture placement followed strict astronomical guidelines. Beds were positioned to align with specific star configurations, while other furniture created geometric patterns believed to channel protective energy. Chairs and tables weren't randomly arranged but formed complex sacred geometries that supposedly trapped evil spirits in mathematical loops. Maintenance of these chambers required specialized knowledge and constant vigilance. Teams of priests performed daily cleansing rituals, while architects regularly adjusted mirror positions to account for seasonal changes in sunlight. The sheer complexity of maintaining these supernatural defense systems meant that a pharaoh's bedroom required more staff attention than most modern luxury hotels. The psychological impact of sleeping in such an environment must have been profound. Every architectural element reinforced the belief that sleep was dangerous, that supernatural threats were real and immediate. Rather than creating peaceful rest, these elaborate protective measures likely increased anxiety and made genuine relaxation nearly impossible. Ancient Egyptians lived in constant terror of what would happen to their bodies and souls after death. But this fear didn't wait politely until they actually died. It invaded their dreams every single night. Mummification anxieties plagued pharaohs so intensely that many experienced what we'd recognize today as sleep paralysis, convinced that their souls were being prematurely prepared for the afterlife while they were still breathing. Picture yourself as Ramesses II, lying in your elaborate bed, when suddenly you can't move your limbs. Your breathing becomes shallow, your heart pounds against your ribs, and in the flickering lamplight, you swear you see Anubis approaching with his embalming tools. Modern sleep researchers understand this as a perfectly normal neurological phenomenon, but ancient Egyptians interpreted sleep paralysis as evidence that the mummification process had begun prematurely. The mainstream historical understanding focuses on mummification as a post-death ritual. But here's the disturbing detail that keeps historians up at night. Many pharaohs became so obsessed with the process that they practiced living mummification ceremonies, wrapping themselves in linen bandages before sleep to familiarize their souls with the sensation. Talk about taking method acting to an unhealthy extreme. Papyrus scrolls from the New Kingdom describe recurring nightmares where pharaohs found themselves on embalming tables, fully conscious while priests removed their organs. These weren't random anxiety dreams, they were detailed, technically accurate visions of the mummification process that suggest these rulers had witnessed the procedure so many times it became embedded in their subconscious. Imagine having such intimate knowledge of your own future corpse preparation that it haunted your sleep. Sleep paralysis episodes were particularly terrifying because ancient Egyptians believed the soul could become permanently separated from the body during these experiences. Medical papyri describes symptoms that perfectly match modern sleep paralysis: temporary inability to move, feeling of pressure on the chest, and vivid hallucinations of supernatural beings. However, their interpretation was far more sinister. They thought these episodes were practice runs for death itself. Historians still argue whether these mummification nightmares were caused by genuine religious terror or by the psychological trauma of witnessing actual embalming procedures. Royal children were often present during mummification ceremonies as part of their education, potentially creating lifelong associations between sleep and death preparation. Royal physicians developed elaborate treatments for what they called premature soul departure syndrome. These remedies included drinking potions made from ground mummy wrappings. Yes, they literally consumed bits of other people's burial preparations to prevent their own souls from leaving too early. The irony is delicious, using death to prevent death-related nightmares. Dream journals from several pharaohs reveal obsessive documentation of mummification-related nightmares. Tutankhamun's personal scribe recorded over 200 dreams involving embalming procedures, organ removal, and conversations with his own mummified corpse. Reading these accounts today, you can practically feel the young pharaoh's terror seeping through the hieroglyphics. protective rituals against mummification nightmares became increasingly elaborate and bizarre. Some pharaohs slept with their organs symbolically, pre-removed, clay replicas of their liver, lungs, stomach, and intestines were placed in canopic jars beside their beds. The logic was that if their organs were already safely stored, dream embalmers couldn't steal them during sleep. Temple records describe pharaohs who became so terrified of mummification dreams that they refused to sleep lying down, convinced that horizontal positioning made their souls more vulnerable to premature departure. These rulers spent years sleeping sitting upright in specially designed chairs, leading to chronic back problems and even more sleep disturbances. The psychological impact of living with constant mummification anxiety was devastating. Several pharaohs developed what modern psychologists would recognize as thanatophobia, an irrational fear of death that paradoxically made them more likely to die from stress-related illnesses. The very process designed to ensure eternal life was literally killing them through sleep deprivation and anxiety. Priests capitalized on these fears by selling increasingly expensive protective services. Dream embalmers, specialized priests who claimed they could perform protective mummification rituals on sleeping pharaohs, charged enormous fees for their services. These charlatans would whisper protective spells over sleeping rulers while performing mock embalming procedures with blessed oils and fake surgical instruments. Archaeological evidence suggests that some pharaohs became so obsessed with controlling their mummification dreams that they commissioned detailed scale models of embalming chambers, complete with miniature tools and priest figurines. These elaborate dollhouses of death were kept beside their beds, allowing them to practice the procedure in their minds before sleep. The most disturbing aspect of mummification-related sleep paralysis was how it created a feedback loop of terror. Fear of the dreams made pharaohs more anxious, which increased the likelihood of sleep paralysis episodes, which reinforced their belief that supernatural forces were actively trying to kill them. Breaking this cycle required interventions that often made the problem worse. Dream interpretation in ancient Egypt wasn't just a mystical practice, it was a matter of life, death, and political survival that could topple dynasties with a single nightmare. Royal dream readers held more power than generals or high priests because they possessed the terrifying ability to transform a pharaoh's subconscious anxieties into prophecies of doom that shaped the fate of entire civilizations. Entering the sacred chambers where dream interpretation took place, you'd find yourself in rooms that resembled a cross between a library and a torture chamber. Massive papyrus scrolls covered every surface, containing thousands of documented dream symbols and their potential meanings. The air thick with incense couldn't mask the underlying tension. Everyone present knew that a single misinterpreted dream could result in executions, wars, or the complete restructuring of the royal succession. The mainstream historical fact about Egyptian dream interpretation focuses on its religious significance. But here's the chilling detail that most scholars gloss over. Dream readers were essentially state-sanctioned psychological terrorists who used Pharaoh's nightmares to manipulate political decisions. These weren't gentle spiritual advisors, they were master manipulators who understood that a sleep-deprived, anxious ruler was infinitely easier to control than a well-rested one. Professional dream interpreters underwent decades of training that would make modern psychologists weep with envy. They memorized not just dream symbols but also the personal histories, political pressures, and psychological vulnerabilities of every pharaoh they served. master interpreters could predict what types of dreams a ruler would have based on recent political events, then craft interpretations that pushed the pharaoh towards specific decisions. Royal dream journals reveal the sophisticated psychological warfare that occurred nightly in pharaonic bedrooms. Amenhotep III's dream reader, a priest named Kamwaset, documented over 15 years of the pharaoh's nightmares and their interpretations. Reading these records today, you can see clear patterns of manipulation. Dreams about flooding were interpreted as warnings against specific military campaigns, while dreams about animals were used to justify changes in religious policy. Historians still argue whether dream interpreters genuinely believed in their supernatural abilities or were simply skilled political operators using religious authority to influence state decisions. The evidence suggests a disturbing combination of both: true believers who had convinced themselves that their political manipulations were divinely inspired. The most feared type of dream was the succession nightmare, visions where pharaohs saw themselves being replaced by rivals, family members, or even their own children. Dream interpreters developed elaborate classification systems for these dreams, with different variations requiring different preventive actions. Some interpretations demanded immediate executions, while others called for complex religious ceremonies that could take months to complete. Competitive dream interpretation created a cutthroat environment where rival priests would deliberately trigger nightmares in pharaohs to discredit their colleagues' protective abilities. Secret recipes for nightmare-inducing incense were passed down through generations, while counteragents developed equally sophisticated methods for promoting peaceful sleep. The royal bedroom became a battlefield where psychological warfare was waged through carefully manipulated dreams. Training new dream interpreters involved exposing them to controlled nightmare experiences using various herbs and psychological techniques. Apprentices learned to recognize the physical signs of different types of dreams by observing sleeping subjects, then practiced crafting interpretations that would produce desired political outcomes. The most skilled practitioners could induce specific types of dreams in their subjects through careful manipulation of diet, environment, and pre-sleep suggestions. Documentation from the reign of Akhenaten reveals how dream interpretation was used to justify his radical religious reforms. His personal dream reader, a mysterious figure known only as the voice of Ra, claimed to receive divine instructions through the pharaoh's dreams that supported the transition to monotheistic worship. Modern analysis suggests these divine messages were carefully orchestrated psychological manipulations designed to provide religious justification for political changes. The psychological toll on pharaohs subjected to constant dream analysis was enormous. Many rulers developed what we'd recognize as chronic anxiety disorders, becoming so obsessed with the potential meanings of their dreams that they could barely function during waking hours. Some pharaohs began deliberately staying awake for days at a time to avoid the political consequences of their subconscious minds. Economic records showed that dream interpretation services consumed enormous portions of royal budgets. Elaborate ceremonies to counteract negative dream interpretations could cost the equivalent of building a small pyramid, while the salaries of master dream readers rivaled those of military commanders. The ancient Egyptian economy was partially built on the monetization of royal nightmares. The most disturbing aspect of royal dream interpretation was how it created self-fulfilling prophecies. Dreams about military defeats led to hesitant battle strategies that actually caused defeats, while nightmares about political betrayals created the paranoid atmosphere that encouraged actual betrayals. The Pharaohs' subconscious fears, amplified and manipulated by skilled interpreters, became the very realities they were trying to avoid. Protective amulets and bedside magic transformed pharaonic sleeping quarters into supernatural armories where hundreds of bizarre talismans waged nightly war against invisible enemies. Clutching these objects with desperate intensity, rulers of the ancient world reduced themselves to terrified children afraid of monsters under the bed, except their monsters were very real according to their belief system, and the consequences of inadequate protection could doom their eternal souls. Examining a pharaoh's bedside collection would reveal an obsessive-compulsive disorder disguised as religious devotion. Golden scarab beetles programmed to roll away nightmares, ivory hippopotamus figurines designed to devour dream demons, and carved wooden headrests that supposedly prevented souls from wandering too far during sleep. Each item required specific positioning, particular activation rituals, and regular maintenance by specialized priests who charged astronomical fees for their services. The mainstream historical understanding presents these amulets as beautiful religious artifacts, but here's the unsettling reality that museum curators rarely mention. Many protective items were crafted from disturbing materials including ground human bones, dried blood from sacred animals, and substances that would violate numerous modern health regulations. Pharaohs literally surrounded themselves with death to protect against death. Royal amulet collections grew exponentially throughout each reign as paranoia compounded with political pressures. Tutankhamun's tomb contained over 400 protective items specifically designed for sleep protection, while Ramesses II's collection reportedly required an entire room for storage. These weren't casual spiritual accessories, they were desperate attempts to control the uncontrollable realm of dreams and supernatural threats. Specialized craftsmen called nightmare smiths developed increasingly elaborate protective devices that bordered on the absurd. Mechanical amulets with moving parts that supposedly confused evil spirits, multi-layered talismans that required complex activation sequences, and combination locks that prevented demons from accessing their protective powers. The ancient Egyptian equivalent of high-tech security systems, except they were designed to protect against supernatural rather than human threats. Historians still argue whether the effectiveness of these protective items stemmed from genuine supernatural properties or sophisticated psychological placebo effects. Modern analysis suggests that the ritual of arranging and activating bedside protections created a sense of control that may have actually improved sleep quality, though the underlying anxiety about needing such extensive protection likely canceled out any benefits. Competitive amulet acquisition created a thriving black market where rare protective items commanded prices that could bankrupt lesser nobles. Authentic pieces blessed by famous priests, amulets crafted during specific astronomical events, and talismans made from materials associated with successful pharaohs became status symbols that demonstrated both wealth and spiritual sophistication. Underground networks of amulet dealers operated throughout the kingdom, smuggling rare protective items between cities and charging premium prices for their supernatural services. The psychological dependency on protective amulets reached pathological levels in many pharaohs. Akhenaten reportedly couldn't sleep without touching at least 12 different protective items in a specific sequence, while Hatshepsut required her amulets to be rearranged nightly according to astronomical calculations. These rituals often took longer than the actual sleep they were meant to protect, creating exhaustion that made the pharaohs more vulnerable to the very nightmares they were trying to prevent. Maintenance requirements for extensive amulet collections created full-time employment for teams of specialized priests. Each protective item required regular cleansing ceremonies, periodic recharging rituals, and careful monitoring for signs of supernatural contamination. Some amulets were considered so powerful that they required their own protective amulets to prevent them from becoming corrupted by evil influences. The bureaucracy of supernatural protection became so complex that pharaohs employed administrative scribes just to track their amulet maintenance schedules. Documentation from royal workshops reveals the incredible complexity involved in creating effective protective amulets. Master craftsmen consulted astronomical charts, performed mathematical calculations based on the pharaoh's birth date, and incorporated materials gathered during specific lunar phases. The creation of a single high-quality protective amulet could take months and require the collaboration of priests, astronomers, and skilled artisans working in perfect synchronization. The most bizarre protective items were the dream catchers, elaborate nets woven from blessed fibers and decorated with precious stones that were suspended above royal beds. These weren't the gentle Native American dream catchers you might recognize, but aggressive supernatural traps designed to capture and destroy evil spirits before they could influence the pharaoh's dreams. Some were so large and heavy that they required reinforced ceiling supports and specialized installation teams. Portable protection became essential when pharaohs traveled, leading to the development of compact amulet sets that could provide adequate supernatural defense away from the heavily fortified royal bedrooms. These travel kits contained miniaturized versions of essential protective items, emergency blessing supplies, and detailed instructions for recreating protective arrangements in unfamiliar locations. Royal caravans required additional pack animals just to transport the pharaoh's mobile supernatural defense systems. The psychological impact of depending on hundreds of protective items for basic sleep created a vicious cycle of increasing anxiety and dependence. Pharaohs who lost or damaged important amulets often experienced panic attacks, while the constant fear that their protective arrangements might be inadequate led to obsessive checking behaviors that prevented restful sleep. Some rulers developed elaborate pre-sleep inspection routines that could take hours to complete. Quality control for protective amulets became a matter of life and death, with specialized inspectors who tested each item's supernatural effectiveness using complex rituals and divination techniques. Defective amulets weren't just returned for refunds, they were considered potential weapons that could be used by enemies to curse the pharaoh's sleep. Testing facilities employed teams of volunteer subjects who risked their own spiritual safety to verify amulet effectiveness. Night demons and evil spirits weren't abstract theological concepts in ancient Egypt, they were specific, named entities with detailed behavioral patterns, preferred attack methods, and documented case histories that read like supernatural criminal profiles. Pharaohs lived in constant terror of these nocturnal predators, each more horrifying than the last, who supposedly stalked the corridors of royal palaces seeking opportunities to devour souls, steal life force, or drive rulers insane through carefully orchestrated nightmare campaigns. Meet Apep, the serpentine embodiment of chaos who slithered through dreams with the specific goal of preventing pharaohs from successfully completing their nightly journey through the underworld. This wasn't some vague force of evil. Ancient texts describe Apep as a calculating predator who studied each pharaoh's psychological weaknesses and crafted personalized terror experiences designed to break their spiritual defenses. Imagine having a supernatural stalker whose full-time job was making your sleep as miserable as possible. The mainstream historical record acknowledges these demons as religious mythology. But here's the disturbing detail that keeps Egyptologists awake at night. The descriptions of demonic encounters in royal dream journals match modern accounts of sleep paralysis, night terrors, and other sleep disorders with uncanny accuracy. Either ancient Egyptians were remarkably skilled at fictional horror writing, or they were documenting real experiences that they interpreted through their supernatural worldview. Ammit, the crocodile-headed devourer of hearts, specialized in judgment nightmares where pharaohs found themselves on trial for their earthly actions. These weren't gentle moral examinations, they were brutal psychological interrogations where every political decision, every military campaign, and every personal relationship was dissected with surgical precision. Royal dream journals describe Ammit's courtroom as a place where pharaohs were forced to relive their worst moments, while supernatural prosecutors presented evidence of their unworthiness. Sekhmet, the lioness goddess of destruction, took a more direct approach to tormenting sleeping pharaohs. Her specialty was fever dreams that left rulers drenched in sweat, convinced that their bodies were being consumed by divine fire. Medical papyri describe symptoms that modern doctors would recognize as severe anxiety attacks, but ancient physicians interpreted these episodes as evidence that Sekhmet was literally cooking the pharaoh's soul in preparation for consumption. Historians still argue whether these demonic encounters were genuine supernatural experiences or sophisticated psychological phenomena triggered by the extreme stress of absolute power. The detailed consistency of descriptions across different pharaohs and time periods suggests either a shared cultural mythology or actual encounters with entities that existed beyond normal human perception. Set, the god of chaos and violence, preferred psychological warfare over direct confrontation. His method involved infiltrating pharaohs' dreams and gradually corrupting their moral compass through subtle suggestions and twisted logic. Royal advisors learned to recognize the signs of Set's influence: sudden changes in policy, unexplained paranoia, and decisions that seemed completely out of character for the affected pharaoh. The demon known as the Whisperer represented perhaps the most insidious threat to royal sleep. This entity specialized in mimicking the voices of trusted advisors, family members, and even the pharaoh's own thoughts, gradually introducing doubts and fears that would fester in the subconscious mind. Detection was nearly impossible because the Whisperer's suggestions felt like the pharaoh's own ideas, making it the perfect tool for psychological manipulation. Protective protocols against specific demons became incredibly elaborate and specialized. Different entities required different defensive strategies. Silver amulets repelled some demons while attracting others. Certain incense combinations drove away particular threats, while creating vulnerabilities to different attacks. Royal bedrooms became complex supernatural laboratories where priests conducted nightly experiments in demon-proofing techniques. Documentation from the reign of Ramesses III reveals a systematic approach to cataloging demonic encounters. His personal demon hunter, a priest named Horus Saset, maintained detailed records of each supernatural attack, including the demon's apparent identity, attack method, duration of encounter, and effectiveness of various defensive measures. These records read like modern paranormal investigation reports, complete with witness statements and physical evidence. The psychological impact of believing in specific, named entities that were actively hunting you created a level of paranoia that modern people can barely comprehend. Pharaohs developed elaborate personal mythologies around their demonic enemies, complete with backstories explaining why particular demons had chosen them as targets. Some rulers became convinced that their political enemies were collaborating with supernatural forces, leading to purges based on dream-derived evidence. Competitive demon fighting created a lucrative industry where priests specialized in combating specific types of supernatural threats. Master exorcists commanded enormous fees for their services, while lesser practitioners offered budget-friendly protection packages that often proved inadequate when faced with high-level demonic attacks. The ancient Egyptian equivalent of cybersecurity, except the hackers were interdimensional entities with personal vendettas. Training programs for anti-demon specialists involved exposing apprentices to controlled supernatural encounters using various ritual techniques and consciousness-altering substances. Advanced practitioners learned to enter dream states voluntarily to engage demons in direct combat, though the psychological casualties from these training programs were reportedly quite high. Imagine attending a university where the final exam involved fighting your nightmares in hand-to-hand combat. The most feared demons were those that operated in coordinated groups, launching simultaneous attacks that overwhelmed even the most sophisticated protective systems. Royal security protocols included contingency plans for demonic swarm attacks that required immediate evacuation of the pharaoh to specially prepared safe rooms with enhanced supernatural defenses. These emergency procedures were practiced regularly, like supernatural fire drills. Economic records show that demon fighting consumed enormous portions of royal budgets, with some pharaohs spending more on supernatural security than on their actual military forces. The irony wasn't lost on contemporary observers. Rulers who could command vast armies were helpless against enemies that existed primarily in their own minds, yet the threat felt so real that they bankrupted their kingdoms trying to fight shadows. Pharaohs' insomnia and political paranoia created a vicious cycle where sleeplessness bred suspicion, and suspicion destroyed sleep, transforming the most powerful rulers in the ancient world into hollow-eyed shadows of their former selves who saw assassins in every corner and conspiracies in every whispered conversation. Chronic sleep deprivation didn't just affect their health, it fundamentally altered their decision-making abilities, turning rational leaders into erratic tyrants whose midnight fears shaped the destiny of entire civilizations. Ramesses II's personal physician documented over 3 years of the pharaoh's complete inability to sleep for more than 2 hours consecutively, a condition that began after a failed assassination attempt and gradually consumed his sanity. The great conqueror who had dominated the battlefield became a trembling insomniac who required food tasters, body doubles, and armed guards even in his private sleeping chambers. Sleep became the enemy because unconsciousness meant vulnerability, yet the lack of sleep made him infinitely more vulnerable to the very threats he was trying to avoid. The mainstream historical narrative focuses on pharaohs as confident god-kings, but here's the terrifying reality that palace scribes carefully concealed. Many rulers spent their final years in states of complete psychological breakdown, unable to distinguish between real threats and paranoid delusions brought on by chronic sleep deprivation. Court records describe pharaohs who ordered executions based on dreams, declared war on neighboring kingdoms because of imagined slights, and restructured their entire governments to combat threats that existed only in their exhausted minds. Political paranoia reached its peak during the reign of Akhenaten, whose radical religious reforms may have been driven more by sleep-deprived hallucinations than divine inspiration. His personal guards reported that the pharaoh often spent entire nights pacing his chambers, muttering about conspiracies involving his own family members, priests, and even the gods themselves. The monotheistic revolution that changed Egyptian religion forever might have been the product of a severely sleep-deprived mind trying to simplify a world that had become too complex to comprehend. Medical papyri from the New Kingdom describe symptoms that modern doctors would immediately recognize as severe sleep disorders: racing thoughts, hypervigilance, auditory hallucinations, and paranoid ideation. Ancient physicians had no understanding of sleep cycles, REM sleep, or the neurological consequences of chronic insomnia, so they attributed these symptoms to supernatural attacks or divine punishment, treatments that often made the underlying problems worse. Historians still argue whether the political instability of certain dynasties was caused by external threats or by the psychological deterioration of sleep-deprived rulers who created chaos through their paranoid decision-making. The evidence suggests a disturbing pattern where successful pharaohs gradually destroyed their own kingdoms through increasingly erratic policies driven by insomnia-induced paranoia. Palace security measures designed to help pharaohs sleep actually made their insomnia worse by reinforcing the belief that they were in constant danger. Elaborate guard rotations, secret passages, and multiple layers of protection created an atmosphere of siege mentality that made relaxation impossible. Some pharaohs became so paranoid about their own security forces that they employed guards to watch the guards, creating surveillance systems so complex that nobody could sleep peacefully. The psychological warfare tactics used by rival kingdoms specifically targeted pharaohs' sleep patterns through carefully orchestrated campaigns of psychological intimidation. Enemy agents would leave threatening messages in places that should have been secure, arrange for disturbing sounds to occur at specific times during the night, and spread rumors designed to increase the pharaoh's paranoia about internal threats. Ancient psychological warfare was remarkably sophisticated in its understanding of how sleep deprivation could be weaponized. Succession planning became nearly impossible when pharaohs were too paranoid to trust their own children or designated heirs. Sleep-deprived rulers often changed their succession plans multiple times, sometimes within the same week, creating political instability that lasted for generations. The fear that family members were plotting against them led to purges that eliminated competent administrators and left kingdoms vulnerable to external conquest. Royal physicians developed increasingly desperate treatments for pharaonic insomnia, including surgical procedures that were supposed to remove the physical causes of sleeplessness. Some treatments involved drilling holes in the skull to release evil spirits, while others required the consumption of substances that would be considered highly toxic by modern standards. The cure was often worse than the disease, leading to additional health problems that made sleep even more elusive. Documentation from the reign of Tutankhamun suggests that even young pharaohs weren't immune to political paranoia and sleep disorders. His tomb contained an unusual number of protective items specifically designed to prevent assassination during sleep, while medical examination of his mummy revealed evidence of chronic stress that would have made restful sleep nearly impossible. The boy king who died at 19 may have been killed by the very paranoia that was supposed to protect him. Economic consequences of pharaonic insomnia were devastating for entire kingdoms. Sleep-deprived rulers made impulsive financial decisions, launched expensive military campaigns based on paranoid fantasies, and created bureaucratic systems so complex that they collapsed under their own weight. The prosperity of ancient Egypt was often held hostage by the sleep patterns of individual pharaohs whose personal psychological problems became national crises. The most tragic aspect of pharaonic insomnia was how it created self-fulfilling prophecies. Paranoid rulers who suspected everyone of treachery often behaved in ways that actually encouraged rebellion, while their erratic decision-making provided legitimate reasons for political opponents to consider removing them from power. The very paranoia that kept them awake at night eventually created the conditions that justified their fears. Sacred sleep positions and rituals weren't casual bedtime preferences in ancient Egypt, they were precise spiritual technologies that pharaohs believed could mean the difference between safe passage through the underworld and eternal damnation. Every angle of the body, every placement of limbs, and every orientation relative to cardinal directions carried supernatural significance that required mathematical precision and astronomical calculations to execute properly. Lying on your left side with your head pointing toward the constellation of Orion wasn't just comfortable, it supposedly aligned your soul with Osiris during his nightly journey across the sky. Ancient sleep manuals, written on papyrus scrolls that were more complex than modern medical textbooks, detailed dozens of approved sleeping positions for different phases of the moon, seasonal changes, and political circumstances. Getting it wrong could result in your soul becoming lost in the underworld, unable to find its way back to your body by morning. The mainstream historical understanding treats these as quaint religious customs. But here's the mind-bending detail that sleep researchers are only beginning to appreciate. Many of these ancient sleep positions actually do promote better rest and align with modern understanding of optimal sleep posture. Either ancient Egyptians stumbled onto scientifically sound sleep practices through supernatural beliefs, or their priests possessed sophisticated knowledge about human physiology that wouldn't be rediscovered for thousands of years. Pharaohs employed specialized sleep choreographers, priests who spent years studying the intricate relationships between body position, astronomical events, and spiritual safety. These experts could calculate the exact angle at which a pharaoh's spine should be positioned on any given night, taking into account the ruler's birth chart, recent political events, and the current positions of various deities in the celestial sphere. Imagine needing a PhD in astronomy just to lie down properly. The Osiris position was the most sacred and dangerous sleeping arrangement, reserved for pharaohs who needed to communicate directly with the god of the underworld. This position required the pharaoh to lie completely flat with arms crossed over the chest, mimicking the pose of a mummy, while maintaining perfect stillness throughout the night. Movement of any kind could supposedly trap the soul in the death realm permanently, making this position the ultimate test of spiritual courage and physical discipline. Historians still argue whether these elaborate sleep positions were genuine spiritual practices or sophisticated psychological techniques designed to promote deeper, more restful sleep through focused attention and ritual preparation. The evidence suggests that the careful positioning and pre-sleep rituals may have actually functioned as effective relaxation techniques, though the underlying anxiety about getting it wrong probably canceled out most benefits. Seasonal sleep rotations required pharaohs to completely reorganize their sleeping arrangements 4 times per year, aligning their bodies with the changing positions of key constellations and the flooding cycles of the Nile. During flood season, pharaohs slept with their feet elevated to symbolically rise above the chaos of the waters, while harvest season required a specific curled position that supposedly helped channel the earth's fertility into the ruler's dreams. The Ra's journey position involved a complex sequence of movements that pharaohs performed throughout the night, gradually rotating their bodies to follow the sun god's path through the underworld. This wasn't simply rolling over in your sleep, it required conscious awareness and precise timing that made continuous rest nearly impossible. Royal sleep attendants used water clocks and astronomical instruments to wake pharaohs at specific intervals for position changes. Training in sacred sleep positions began in childhood for royal heirs, with young princes and princesses practicing the complex arrangements under the supervision of master sleep priests. Children who couldn't master the basic positions by adolescence were sometimes removed from the line of succession, as the ability to sleep properly was considered essential for effective rule. The pressure to perform these positions perfectly created additional anxiety that made restful sleep even more elusive. Documentation from various dynasties reveals that different pharaohs favored different sleeping systems, leading to political conflicts between rival schools of sleep theology. The northern position. Advocates believed that sleeping with the head pointing toward the North Star provided maximum protection, while solar alignment. Practitioners insisted that following the sun's path was more important. These weren't academic debates, they were matters of spiritual life and death that influenced royal policy. Mechanical aids for maintaining proper sleep positions became increasingly elaborate as pharaohs aged and found it difficult to maintain the required poses naturally. Specially designed beds with adjustable sections, restraining devices that prevented unconscious movement, and even primitive alarm systems that detected position changes transformed royal bedrooms into complex sleep laboratories that prioritized spiritual correctness over physical comfort. The psychological pressure of maintaining perfect sleep positions created a new category of royal anxiety disorder. Pharaohs who moved during sleep often woke up in panic, convinced that their souls had been compromised by improper positioning. Some rulers developed obsessive checking behaviors, waking up multiple times per night to verify that they were still in the correct position, which completely defeated the purpose of trying to sleep. Emergency position correction protocols were developed for situations where pharaohs accidentally moved during sleep. These procedures involved immediate awakening, purification rituals, and complex ceremonies to repair any spiritual damage caused by improper positioning. The cure was often more disruptive than the original problem, creating cascading sleep disturbances that could last for weeks. Nighttime palace security and guards created a paradoxical situation where the very people meant to protect sleeping pharaohs became sources of additional terror and sleeplessness. Elite soldiers stationed throughout royal bedchambers weren't just standing at attention, they were participating in an elaborate psychological theater where every footstep, every whispered communication, and every shift change reinforced the message that mortal danger lurked in every shadow. Royal Guard rotations operated on principles that would make modern security experts weep with frustration. Rather than maintaining quiet professionalism, ancient Egyptian palace guards were required to perform hourly vocal confirmations of their vigilance, calling out coded phrases that echoed through the corridors all night long. These weren't subtle security checks, they were loud, ritualistic announcements that reminded everyone, especially the pharaoh, that threats were so imminent that constant verbal verification was necessary. The mainstream historical understanding focuses on palace guards as loyal protectors. But here's the disturbing reality that military historians rarely discuss. Many of these elite soldiers were recruited from conquered territories and foreign mercenaries whose loyalty was purchased rather than earned. Pharaohs literally surrounded themselves with armed strangers whose primary qualification was their ability to kill efficiently, then tried to sleep peacefully knowing that their lives depended on the continued satisfaction of professional warriors. Guard selection processes for royal bedroom duty involved psychological evaluations that were remarkably sophisticated for their time. Candidates underwent tests designed to identify potential traitors, including dream analysis sessions where their sleeping patterns were monitored for signs of disloyalty. The irony was delicious. Guards whose job was protecting the pharaoh's sleep were themselves subjected to sleep surveillance that could end their careers or their lives. Weapon protocols within royal sleeping chambers created an atmosphere of barely contained violence that made relaxation impossible. Guards carried specific types of blades designed for close-quarters combat in darkness, while emergency weapon caches were hidden throughout the bedroom in case the primary security force was compromised. Pharaohs fell asleep to the sound of metal against leather as guards adjusted their equipment, a constant reminder that violence could erupt at any moment. Historians still argue whether the elaborate security measures actually made pharaohs safer or simply created more opportunities for betrayal by increasing the number of armed individuals with access to the royal bedchamber. The evidence suggests that many assassination attempts were actually carried out by members of the security force itself, making the protection system a potential delivery mechanism for the very threats it was designed to prevent. Communication systems between guards involved complex networks of hand signals, coded whistles, and mirror-based light signals that created a constant background of activity throughout the night. These weren't discrete security measures, they were obvious, attention-grabbing displays that made it impossible for anyone in the palace to forget that danger was imminent. The psychological impact on the pharaoh was devastating, as every signal could indicate either routine security or an active threat. Training programs for royal guards included specialized instruction in silent killing, techniques that were supposedly necessary for eliminating threats without waking the pharaoh. The problem was that pharaohs were fully aware of these training programs, which meant they knew their protectors were skilled assassins who could kill them without making a sound. Trying to sleep while surrounded by people trained in silent murder required a level of trust that few humans could maintain. Guard loyalty was maintained through a combination of generous compensation, family hostages, and regular loyalty tests that involved staged assassination scenarios. These tests weren't theoretical exercises, they were realistic simulations where guards had to choose between following orders and protecting the pharaoh, with failure resulting in immediate execution. The psychological pressure on guards was enormous, creating a security force that was as likely to crack under stress as to perform effectively. Documentation from palace archives reveals that guard-related incidents were far more common than external threats. Nervous guards killing each other in cases of mistaken identity, security protocols that prevented guards from responding effectively to real threats, and communication breakdowns that led to friendly fire incidents. The cure was often worse than the disease, with security measures creating more danger than they prevented. Sleeping arrangements for guards created additional complications, as tired protectors were ineffective protectors. Elaborate shift schedules were designed to ensure that guards remained alert throughout the night, but these schedules often resulted in sleep-deprived soldiers who were more likely to make mistakes or fall asleep at their posts. The pharaoh's insomnia was matched by the chronic exhaustion of his protectors. Psychological warfare tactics used by enemies specifically targeted the guard force through bribery, blackmail, and disinformation campaigns designed to create suspicion and paranoia within the security ranks. Enemy agents would plant evidence suggesting that certain guards were traitors, leading to purges that eliminated loyal protectors and created gaps in the security perimeter. The pharaoh's enemies understood that destroying trust within the guard force was more effective than direct assault. Quality control for palace guards involved regular testing of their reflexes, loyalty, and combat skills through surprise drills that could occur at any time during the night. These tests were so realistic that guards sometimes couldn't distinguish between drills and actual threats, leading to incidents where they attacked innocent palace staff or each other. The constant state of readiness required for these tests made normal sleep impossible for everyone in the palace. Emergency evacuation procedures for threatened pharaohs were so complex that they required extensive rehearsal and coordination between multiple guard units. These procedures involved secret passages, decoy pharaohs, and predetermined safe houses that were supposed to remain secret but were often compromised by the very people responsible for maintaining them. The elaborate nature of these plans made them vulnerable to sabotage and created additional points of failure. Ancient Egyptian sleep medicine was a bizarre fusion of genuine medical knowledge and supernatural quackery that produced treatments so strange they would make modern pharmaceutical companies blush with embarrassment. Royal physicians approached insomnia as both a physical ailment and a spiritual crisis, creating remedy combinations that included everything from opium-laced wine to ground mummy powder, often administered simultaneously in cocktails that were more likely to kill the patient than cure their sleeplessness. Papyrus Ebers, one of the oldest medical texts in human history, contains over 40 different prescriptions for sleep disorders affecting pharaohs, ranging from relatively sensible herbal teas to absolutely horrifying concoctions that included human brain tissue, crocodile dung, and fermented fish oil. These weren't desperate last resorts, they were standard treatments prescribed by the most educated physicians in the ancient world, suggesting that medical knowledge and complete insanity often occupied the same professional space. The mainstream historical narrative presents ancient Egyptian medicine as surprisingly advanced, but here's the nightmare-inducing detail that medical historians prefer to downplay. Many sleep remedies were designed to induce unconsciousness through near-fatal poisoning rather than promoting natural rest. Physicians understood that unconscious pharaohs couldn't experience nightmares, so they developed increasingly potent sedatives that walked the fine line between therapeutic sleep and accidental death. Royal sleep physicians underwent decades of training that combined legitimate medical knowledge with elaborate supernatural theories about the relationship between physical health and spiritual vulnerability. These doctors could accurately diagnose various sleep disorders while simultaneously believing that the treatments required astronomical calculations, divine intervention, and the sacrifice of specific animals under particular lunar conditions. Medical school was apparently much more interesting 3,000 years ago. Opium cultivation in ancient Egypt was primarily dedicated to producing sleep aids for the royal family, with entire agricultural regions devoted to growing poppies under the supervision of priest-physicians who understood both the plant's medicinal properties and its potential for creating dependency. Pharaohs who became addicted to opium-based sleep remedies often found that their cure had become worse than their original insomnia, requiring increasingly dangerous doses to achieve unconsciousness. Historians still argue whether ancient Egyptian physicians understood the addictive properties of their sleep medications or genuinely believed they were providing harmless medical treatment. The evidence suggests a disturbing combination of both: doctors who recognized the dependency potential but considered it an acceptable trade-off for ensuring that pharaohs could sleep without experiencing supernatural attacks. Herbal sleep remedies involved complex combinations of plants that were gathered during specific astronomical conditions and prepared according to recipes that read like magical spells. Lotus petals harvested at midnight, mandrake roots dug up during solar eclipses, and willow bark stripped from trees that had been struck by lightning. The pharmaceutical supply chain was so complicated that obtaining ingredients for a single sleep potion could take months of preparation. Surgical treatments for chronic insomnia included procedures that would violate every principle of modern medical ethics. Trepanation, drilling holes in the skull, was performed to release evil spirits that were supposedly preventing sleep, while other operations involved removing pieces of bone from the nose and ears to improve the flow of healing vapors to the brain. The recovery time from these cures often lasted longer than the original sleep problems. Dietary modifications prescribed for insomniac pharaohs created nutritional disasters that probably made their sleep problems worse. Physicians recommended avoiding foods that were associated with wakefulness, including most fruits and vegetables, while encouraging consumption of heavy, fatty meals that were believed to promote drowsiness. The resulting digestive problems and nutritional deficiencies created additional health issues that interfered with natural sleep patterns. Animal-based remedies reached levels of absurdity that would be hilarious if they weren't so disturbing. Physicians prescribed sleeping on beds stuffed with the fur of hibernating animals, drinking milk from cows that had been fed specific herbs, and wearing amulets made from the bones of creatures known for their sleeping habits. The ancient Egyptian medical system apparently operated on the principle that you could absorb the properties of other organisms through close contact. Quality control for sleep medications was virtually non-existent, leading to frequent cases of accidental poisoning when physicians miscalculated dosages or used contaminated ingredients. Royal medical records describe pharaohs who died from their sleep treatments, though these deaths were usually attributed to supernatural causes rather than medical malpractice. The ancient Egyptian equivalent of medical lawsuits involved consulting oracles rather than hiring lawyers. Experimental treatments for royal insomnia included techniques that modern doctors would recognize as early forms of hypnosis, meditation, and even primitive versions of cognitive behavioral therapy. Some physicians understood that psychological factors contributed to sleep problems and developed talking cures that involved lengthy discussions about the pharaoh's fears and anxieties. These sessions were often more effective than the chemical treatments, though they were considered less prestigious by the medical establishment. Competitive medicine created a marketplace where different physicians promoted rival theories about the causes and cures of royal insomnia. Some doctors blamed physical imbalances, others focused on supernatural influences, and a few progressive practitioners suggested that political stress might be contributing to sleep problems. The resulting medical debates were often settled through trial by ordeal rather than scientific evidence. Pharmaceutical preparation involved elaborate rituals that were designed to enhance the spiritual potency of sleep medications while ensuring their physical effectiveness. Medicines were mixed during specific lunar phases, blessed by particular priests, and stored in containers that had been consecrated according to complex religious protocols. The placebo effect was apparently much more elaborate in ancient times. Documentation from Royal Medical Archives reveals that many sleep treatments were more effective as psychological interventions than as pharmacological solutions. The elaborate preparation rituals, the involvement of prestigious physicians, and the expensive ingredients created a sense of importance and efficacy that may have been more therapeutic than the actual medications. Ancient Egyptian medicine understood the power of belief long before modern science discovered the placebo effect. Prophetic dreams and divine messages weren't gentle spiritual experiences for ancient Egyptian pharaohs, they were terrifying supernatural downloads that could reshape entire kingdoms overnight and doom rulers who misinterpreted the gods' intentions. Divine communication through dreams was considered so dangerous that pharaohs often preferred insomnia to the risk of receiving messages they couldn't understand or commands they couldn't fulfill, creating a paradox where avoiding sleep became a form of religious devotion. Receiving a prophetic dream was like being handed a nuclear weapon with unclear instructions, immensely powerful but potentially catastrophic if mishandled. Pharaohs who claimed divine visions gained enormous political authority, but they also became prisoners of their own supernatural experiences, forced to implement policies based on dream logic that often defied practical governance. The pressure to act on divine messages, combined with the fear of divine punishment for inaction, created a psychological torture chamber disguised as religious privilege. The mainstream historical narrative presents prophetic dreams as sources of wisdom and guidance, but here's the soul-crushing reality that religious historians rarely acknowledge. Most divine messages received by pharaohs were contradictory, impossible to implement, or so vague that they could be interpreted in dozens of different ways. Gods apparently weren't concerned with providing clear, actionable advice. They preferred cryptic riddles that left pharaohs guessing about the fate of their kingdoms. Thutmose I's famous dream at the Great Sphinx, where the monument supposedly promised him the throne in exchange for clearing away sand, sounds inspiring until you realize the psychological pressure this created. Every subsequent pharaoh wondered why the gods weren't speaking to them directly, leading to increasingly desperate attempts to induce prophetic dreams through dangerous rituals, extreme fasting, and consciousness-altering substances that often resulted in hallucinations rather than genuine divine communication. Divine message authentication became a critical skill for pharaohs who needed to distinguish between genuine prophetic dreams and anxiety-induced nightmares that masqueraded as supernatural communication. Royal dream interpreters developed elaborate testing procedures to verify the authenticity of divine messages, but these tests were often more politically motivated than spiritually accurate, with interpreters telling pharaohs what they wanted to hear rather than what the gods actually intended. Historians still argue whether the prophetic dreams recorded in royal archives were genuine supernatural experiences, sophisticated political propaganda, or the psychological manifestations of extreme stress and responsibility. The consistency of certain prophetic themes across different pharaohs suggests either shared cultural expectations or actual divine intervention, though the evidence remains frustratingly ambiguous. Competitive prophecy created a marketplace where different gods supposedly competed for pharaonic attention through increasingly dramatic dream messages. Ra might promise military victory through one dream, while Ta offered economic prosperity through another, leaving pharaohs to choose between conflicting divine advice that could determine the fate of their kingdoms. The gods apparently weren't interested in coordinating their messages for maximum clarity. The psychological burden of receiving divine messages was enormous, as pharaohs became responsible not just for their own decisions but for accurately interpreting and implementing the will of the gods. Mistakes in divine interpretation could result in military defeats, natural disasters, or supernatural punishment that affected entire populations. The weight of divine responsibility often proved more crushing than the burden of earthly power. Documentation from the Amarna period reveals how Akhenaten's radical religious reforms may have been driven by a series of prophetic dreams that convinced him to abandon traditional Egyptian polytheism in favor of monotheistic worship. His divine messages apparently included detailed instructions for restructuring Egyptian religion, relocating the capital city, and fundamentally altering artistic styles. Either the god Aten was remarkably specific in his communication, or Akhenaten was experiencing elaborate hallucinations that he interpreted as divine revelation. Prophetic dream journals kept by various pharaohs reveal the exhausting mental gymnastics required to reconcile divine messages with political reality. Gods who promised easy victories that resulted in devastating defeats, divine assurances of eternal rule that preceded early deaths, and supernatural guidance that led to economic disasters. The track record of divine prophecy was remarkably poor, yet pharaohs continued to seek and follow divine guidance because the alternative, ruling without supernatural support, seemed even more terrifying. Emergency protocols for handling urgent divine messages required pharaohs to wake up their entire administrative apparatus in the middle of the night to implement divine commands that couldn't wait until morning. These midnight policy sessions often resulted in hasty decisions that had to be reversed later, creating governmental instability that enemies could exploit. The gods apparently weren't concerned with maintaining consistent foreign policy or administrative efficiency. Training programs for interpreting divine messages involve exposing royal heirs to controlled prophetic experiences through various ritual techniques and consciousness-altering practices. Young princes learned to distinguish between different types of divine communication, though the training often created more confusion than clarity. The curriculum apparently included courses in divine linguistics, supernatural psychology, and prophetic politics. The most disturbing aspect of prophetic dreams was how they created self-fulfilling prophecies that trapped pharaohs in cycles of divine expectation and earthly failure. Dreams that predicted military conflicts often led to aggressive policies that actually caused the predicted wars, while visions of economic prosperity encouraged spending that created the financial problems the prophecies were supposed to prevent. The gods seemed to specialize in creating the very problems they claimed to be solving. Quality control for divine messages was impossible, as questioning the authenticity or accuracy of prophetic dreams was considered blasphemous. Pharaohs who suggested that their divine visions might be inaccurate risked supernatural punishment, while those who followed divine guidance that led to disasters faced earthly consequences. The system was designed to make divine communication unfalsifiable, which made it politically useful but practically disastrous. Psychological support for pharaohs struggling with the burden of divine communication was virtually non-existent, as admitting difficulty in interpreting divine messages was considered a sign of spiritual weakness. Rulers who couldn't handle the pressure of prophetic dreams often suffered in silence, developing anxiety disorders and depression that made them even more vulnerable to misinterpreting divine guidance. The gods apparently weren't interested in providing customer service for their communication systems. Death dreams and succession fears transformed pharaonic sleep into a nightly confrontation with mortality that made modern anxiety about aging seem like a minor inconvenience. Every time a pharaoh closed their eyes, they risked experiencing vivid visions of their own demise, detailed previews of their funeral ceremonies, and terrifying glimpses of potential successors who might be plotting to accelerate the timeline of their death. These weren't abstract fears about distant mortality, they were immediate, visceral experiences that made sleep feel like rehearsals for the grave. Ramesses II's dream journals, discovered in a hidden chamber of his tomb, contain over 300 documented death dreams spanning the final decade of his 67-year reign. These weren't peaceful visions of joining the gods in eternal paradise, they were graphic, detailed nightmares featuring his own mummification, the division of his kingdom among squabbling heirs, and the systematic destruction of his monuments by successors eager to erase his legacy. Imagine trying to get a good night's rest while your subconscious mind provided nightly screenings of your own funeral. The mainstream historical understanding focuses on Pharaoh's confident preparations for the afterlife. But here's the bone-chilling reality that mortuary texts carefully concealed. Many rulers became so terrified of death dreams that they developed elaborate strategies to avoid sleep entirely, preferring chronic exhaustion to the psychological torture of experiencing their own mortality on a nightly basis. Death anxiety didn't wait politely for old age, it invaded the dreams of young pharaohs who had decades of rule ahead of them. Succession nightmares were particularly devastating because they forced pharaohs to confront the political reality that their death would inevitably trigger power struggles that could destroy everything they had built. Dreams featuring sons murdering fathers, brothers betraying brothers, and queens orchestrating palace coups weren't random anxiety fantasies, they were psychologically accurate predictions based on the pharaoh's intimate knowledge of their own family's ambitions and capabilities. Tutankhamun's brief reign was apparently plagued by death dreams that began almost immediately after his coronation at age 9. Palace records describe a child pharaoh who was afraid to sleep alone because his dreams consistently featured his own assassination by various court officials, family members, and even his own bodyguards. The boy king's paranoia about succession plots may have been justified, given that he died under mysterious circumstances before reaching adulthood. Historians still argue whether the prevalence of death dreams among pharaohs was caused by genuine supernatural premonitions or by the psychological pressure of knowing that their position made them constant targets for assassination and political manipulation. The detailed accuracy of some death dreams, particularly those that correctly predicted specific succession crises, suggests either remarkable intuitive abilities or access to information about actual plots against their lives. Preventive measures against death dreams included sleeping in different locations each night, using body doubles to confuse potential supernatural surveillance, and employing dream catchers specifically designed to trap visions of mortality before they could reach the pharaoh's consciousness. These precautions often made the underlying anxiety worse by reinforcing the belief that death was actively stalking them through their dreams. The psychological impact of succession fears was compounded by the pharaohs' knowledge that their own rise to power had often involved eliminating potential rivals, including family members who posed threats to their legitimacy. Rulers who had murdered their way to the throne understood exactly how vulnerable they were to similar tactics, creating a paranoid mindset that made peaceful sleep nearly impossible. Documentation from various dynasties reveals that many pharaohs became obsessed with controlling their succession while still alive, implementing increasingly complex plans to ensure smooth transitions that often created the very instability they were trying to prevent. Elaborate succession ceremonies, detailed inheritance laws, and public declarations of chosen heirs were all attempts to minimize the chaos that death dreams predicted would follow their demise. Death dream interpretation became a specialized field within royal dream analysis, with priests who focused exclusively on helping pharaohs understand the symbolic meaning of their mortality visions. These specialists developed elaborate classification systems for different types of death dreams, though their interpretations often increased rather than decreased the pharaoh's anxiety about their eventual fate. Competitive succession planning created situations where multiple potential heirs were simultaneously preparing for the pharaoh's death, often in ways that made the predicted succession crises more likely to occur. Sons who knew their fathers were having dreams about being murdered by their children sometimes decided that preemptive action was necessary, creating self-fulfilling prophecies that validated the original death dreams. The most disturbing aspect of death dreams was how they provided detailed previews of specific succession scenarios that pharaohs felt compelled to prevent through increasingly desperate measures. Dreams that showed particular heirs seizing power led to purges of potential supporters, while visions of foreign conquest following the pharaoh's death resulted in preemptive military campaigns that often weakened the kingdom's defenses. Training programs for royal heirs included instruction in managing death anxiety and succession fears, though these educational efforts often backfired by making young princes more aware of the various ways they might die or be eliminated by rivals. Learning about the political realities of succession apparently made the psychological burden worse rather than better. Emergency protocols for pharaohs experiencing particularly vivid death dreams included immediate consultations with dream interpreters, purification ceremonies to cleanse away negative visions, and sometimes radical changes in succession planning based on the content of the dreams. These knee-jerk reactions to nightmare content often created political instability that made the predicted problems more likely to occur. Quality control for death dream interpretation was impossible because the accuracy of the predictions could only be verified after the pharaoh's actual death, at which point corrective measures were no longer possible. This created a system where dream interpreters could make increasingly dramatic predictions without facing immediate consequences for their accuracy, leading to escalating levels of succession paranoia. Psychological support for pharaohs struggling with death anxiety was limited to religious counseling that often reinforced rather than alleviated their fears about mortality and succession. Priests who were supposed to provide comfort instead offered detailed descriptions of the afterlife journey that made death seem even more terrifying and complex than the pharaohs had originally imagined. Seasonal sleep patterns and flooding created a cyclical nightmare that transformed the life-giving Nile into a source of annual terror for pharaohs who understood that their kingdom's survival depended on accurately predicting and managing the river's moods. The flooding season wasn't just an agricultural concern, it was a supernatural roulette wheel that could determine whether the pharaoh would be celebrated as a divine intermediary or executed as a failed prophet, making sleep during flood season feel like gambling with the fate of an entire civilization. Flood prediction anxiety reached its peak during the months leading up to the annual inundation, when pharaohs experienced increasingly vivid dreams about catastrophic flooding that would destroy their kingdoms or devastating droughts that would starve their people. These weren't abstract environmental concerns, they were immediate political threats, because pharaohs who failed to properly prepare for flood conditions faced rebellion, invasion, and religious challenges to their divine authority from priests who claimed the gods had withdrawn their support. The mainstream historical narrative presents now flooding as a predictable natural phenomenon that ancient Egyptians managed effectively. But here's the terrifying reality that agricultural historians rarely emphasize. Flood levels vary dramatically from year to year, and pharaohs who guessed wrong about the intensity of flooding faced economic disasters that could topple their dynasties. The pressure to make accurate predictions based on dream interpretation and supernatural guidance created a level of seasonal anxiety that made modern weather forecasters look relaxed by comparison. Nilometers, the ancient devices used to measure flood levels, weren't just practical instruments, but psychological torture devices that provided daily updates on whether the pharaoh's flood predictions were proving accurate. Rising water levels that exceeded predictions meant potential crop destruction and famine, while insufficient flooding threatened drought and economic collapse. Pharaohs often couldn't sleep during flood season because they were constantly monitoring water levels that determined their political survival. Seasonal insomnia patterns among pharaohs followed the agricultural calendar with devastating precision. Sleep disturbances began during the pre-flood season when anxiety about the coming inundation made rest impossible, continued through the flooding period when daily water level reports created constant stress, and persisted into the post-flood season when the actual agricultural results determined whether the pharaoh's predictions had been accurate enough to maintain political legitimacy. Historians still argue whether the elaborate flood prediction rituals were genuine attempts at environmental forecasting or sophisticated political theater designed to give pharaohs plausible explanations for agricultural failures beyond their control. The evidence suggests a disturbing combination of both: rulers who genuinely believed in their supernatural flood prediction abilities while simultaneously understanding the political necessity of having divine scapegoats for natural disasters. Dream-based flood forecasting created a feedback loop where pharaohs' anxiety about flooding influenced their dreams, which in turn shaped their flood predictions, which determined their preparation strategies, which affected the actual outcomes of flood seasons. Rulers who dreamed of catastrophic flooding often overprepared for disasters that never materialized, wasting resources that could have been used for other purposes, while those who dreamed of gentle floods sometimes underprepared for devastating inundations. Competitive flood prediction created situations where different advisors provided conflicting forecasts based on various supernatural and practical indicators, leaving pharaohs to choose between competing predictions that could determine the fate of their kingdoms. Priests who specialized in flood divination, astronomers who tracked celestial patterns, and practical engineers who understood hydraulics all offered different predictions that rarely agreed with each other. The psychological burden of flood responsibility was compounded by the pharaohs' understanding that their flood management decisions affected millions of people who depended on agriculture for survival. Dreams about failed flood predictions often featured graphic visions of starving populations, economic collapse, and political revolution that made the abstract concept of governmental responsibility feel immediate and personal. Documentation from the Middle Kingdom reveals how flood anxiety contributed to the political instability that characterized certain dynasties. Pharaohs who experienced several consecutive years of inaccurate flood predictions often faced challenges to their divine authority from priests and nobles who claimed that the gods had withdrawn their support. The political consequences of environmental forecasting failures could be more devastating than the actual agricultural problems. Emergency protocols for flood-related crises included elaborate contingency plans for both excessive flooding and insufficient inundation, though these plans often conflicted with each other and required resources that weren't available during actual emergencies. Pharaohs who prepared for drought sometimes found themselves unable to respond effectively to floods, while those who anticipated flooding were often caught off guard by drought conditions. Seasonal medication adjustments for pharaohs reflected the understanding that flood anxiety required different treatments than other types of royal insomnia. Sleep remedies during flood season often included specific herbs that were believed to enhance prophetic dreaming while reducing anxiety, though these combinations frequently produced hallucinations that were mistaken for divine flood predictions. The most disturbing aspect of seasonal sleep disruption was how it created annual cycles of governmental instability that enemies could exploit. Foreign kingdoms learned to time their invasions and diplomatic pressure campaigns to coincide with flood season when Egyptian pharaohs were most psychologically vulnerable and least capable of making clear-headed strategic decisions. Training programs for royal heirs included extensive education in flood management and prediction techniques, though this education often increased rather than decreased their anxiety about seasonal responsibilities. Young princes who learned about the political consequences of flood prediction failures sometimes developed anticipatory anxiety that made them less effective at actual flood management when they eventually became pharaohs. Quality control for flood predictions was complicated by the fact that accuracy could only be measured after the flooding season was complete, at which point corrective measures were no longer possible. This created a system where pharaohs could make increasingly dramatic flood predictions without facing immediate consequences for their accuracy, leading to escalating levels of seasonal paranoia and overpreparation. Psychological support for pharaohs struggling with flood anxiety was limited to religious counseling that often emphasized the divine consequences of failed predictions rather than providing practical coping strategies. Priests who were supposed to offer comfort instead reminded pharaohs of historical examples where inaccurate flood forecasting had led to dynastic collapse, making the seasonal anxiety worse rather than better. Royal funeral preparations during life transformed pharaonic existence into a macabre dress rehearsal for death that made modern funeral planning look like casual weekend activities. Living pharaohs didn't just think about their eventual demise, they actively participated in elaborate mock funeral ceremonies, tested their mummification procedures on volunteers, and spent decades perfecting every detail of their death rituals while still breathing. This obsessive preparation for the afterlife created a psychological state where the boundary between life and death became so blurred that many pharaohs couldn't distinguish between their current existence and their future corpse status. Imagine spending your evening hours selecting the perfect arrangement of organs for your canopic jars, debating the optimal wrapping techniques for your mummification, and personally inspecting the construction progress of your eternal resting place. Pharaohs who should have been governing their kingdoms instead devoted enormous amounts of time and energy to choreographing their own death ceremonies, creating a surreal situation where the living ruler was primarily concerned with perfecting his performance as a dead person. The mainstream historical understanding focuses on tomb construction as practical preparation for the afterlife. But here's the psychologically devastating detail that archaeologists rarely discuss. Many pharaohs became so obsessed with their funeral preparations that they lost interest in their actual lives, developing a form of anticipatory grief for their own deaths that made them emotionally unavailable for the responsibilities of living rulership. They were mourning themselves while still alive. Tutankhamun's tomb reveals the extent of this macabre preparation. The young pharaoh who died at 19 had already accumulated enough funeral equipment to supply a small army of corpses. His burial chamber contained multiple backup mummies, alternative sarcophagi for different seasonal conditions, and enough protective amulets to ward off supernatural threats for several lifetimes. The boy king had apparently spent more time preparing for death than he had actually lived. Mock funeral ceremonies became regular palace entertainment, with pharaohs staging elaborate rehearsals of their own death rituals to ensure that every detail would be executed perfectly when the actual event occurred. These weren't solemn religious observances, they were theatrical productions where the pharaoh played the starring role as his own corpse, complete with costume changes, scripted dialogue, and performance reviews from professional mourners. Historians still argue whether this obsessive funeral preparation was driven by genuine religious devotion or by a psychological defense mechanism that allowed pharaohs to maintain the illusion of control over their inevitable deaths. The evidence suggests a disturbing combination of both: rulers who convinced themselves that perfect funeral preparation could somehow delay or improve their actual dying experience. Professional funeral consultants became essential members of the royal court, offering services that ranged from mummification technique optimization to afterlife interior decorating. These specialists commanded enormous fees for their expertise in death preparation, creating a thriving industry built on the pharaoh's terror of dying improperly. The ancient Egyptian equivalent of wedding planners, except they were organizing celebrations of death rather than life. Competitive funeral preparation created situations where pharaohs tried to outdo their predecessors in the elaborateness of their death arrangements, leading to increasingly expensive and complex funeral plans that consumed enormous portions of royal budgets. Some pharaohs spent more on their funeral preparations than on their actual governance, creating economic problems that made their kingdoms more vulnerable to the very threats they were trying to escape through death. The psychological impact of constant funeral preparation was devastating, as pharaohs became so focused on their eventual deaths that they lost the ability to enjoy their current lives. Palace records describe rulers who couldn't eat meals without considering how the food might affect their mummification, couldn't sleep without worrying about the positioning of their corpse, and couldn't make political decisions without considering how they would be judged in the afterlife. Documentation from various dynasties reveals that funeral preparation often became a form of procrastination that allowed pharaohs to avoid dealing with immediate political and personal problems. Rulers who should have been addressing military threats, economic crises, or diplomatic challenges instead spent their time selecting burial jewelry and testing embalming techniques, using death preparation as an escape from the responsibilities of living leadership. Quality control for funeral preparations involved elaborate testing procedures that were often more disturbing than the actual death rituals they were designed to perfect. Volunteer subjects underwent practice mummification procedures to test new techniques, while professional mourners rehearsed their grief performances to ensure optimal emotional impact during the actual funeral. The ancient Egyptian funeral industry apparently had higher quality standards than most modern businesses. Emergency funeral protocols were developed for pharaohs who might die unexpectedly before their elaborate preparation plans could be completed. These contingency plans included backup mummification teams, pre-positioned funeral equipment, and abbreviated ceremony procedures that could be implemented quickly without sacrificing essential afterlife protection. Even spontaneous death required extensive advance planning. The most disturbing aspect of living funeral preparation was how it created a feedback loop where pharaohs became so comfortable with death imagery and rituals that they lost their natural survival instincts. Rulers who spent years practicing being corpses sometimes made political and military decisions that reflected their psychological acceptance of death rather than their commitment to staying alive. Training programs for royal heirs included extensive education in funeral preparation and death ritual management, though this education often created morbid obsessions that interfered with their ability to function as living rulers. Young princes who learned too much about mummification techniques sometimes developed thanatophobia that made them afraid to engage in normal activities that might result in injury or death. Psychological counseling for pharaohs struggling with funeral preparation anxiety was provided by priests who specialized in death psychology, though these counselors often made the problem worse by encouraging even more elaborate preparation rituals. The ancient Egyptian equivalent of therapy apparently involved more death planning rather than less, creating therapeutic interventions that reinforced the very obsessions they were supposed to treat. Maintenance requirements for extensive funeral preparations created full-time employment for teams of specialists who monitored the condition of burial equipment, updated funeral plans based on changing political circumstances, and conducted regular inspections of tomb construction progress. The bureaucracy of death preparation was apparently more complex than the administration of living kingdoms, requiring more staff attention than actual governance. Legacy of ancient sleep fears connects the pharaoh's nocturnal terrors to modern understanding of dreams and anxiety in ways that would make contemporary sleep researchers both fascinated and horrified. The elaborate supernatural defense systems, the obsessive protective rituals, and the paralyzing fear of unconsciousness that plagued ancient Egyptian rulers weren't just historical curiosities, they were sophisticated responses to universal human anxieties about vulnerability, mortality, and loss of control that continue to shape how we approach sleep today. Modern sleep medicine recognizes many of the symptoms documented in pharaonic dream journals as classic manifestations of anxiety disorders, PTSD, and chronic insomnia that respond to treatments the ancient Egyptians never could have imagined. Sleep paralysis episodes that pharaohs interpreted as supernatural attacks are now understood as neurological phenomena affecting millions of people worldwide, while the night terrors that convinced rulers they were being stalked by demons are recognized as treatable sleep disorders rather than evidence of divine punishment. The mainstream narrative suggests that modern civilization has moved beyond such primitive fears about sleep and dreams. But here's the uncomfortable truth that sleep researchers are reluctant to acknowledge. Contemporary anxiety about sleep often mirrors the pharaoh's concerns in disturbing ways. Modern insomniacs who obsessively monitor their sleep patterns, purchase elaborate sleep optimization equipment, and develop complex bedtime rituals are engaging in behaviors that would be familiar to any ancient Egyptian pharaoh. Pharmaceutical approaches to sleep disorders echo the ancient Egyptian practice of using chemical interventions to achieve unconsciousness, though modern sleep aids are presumably safer than the opium-laced wine and ground mummy powder cocktails favored by royal physicians. The underlying logic remains the same. If natural sleep is elusive or frightening, artificial unconsciousness becomes an acceptable alternative, regardless of the potential consequences. Technology-based sleep monitoring systems that track every aspect of our nocturnal experience represent a sophisticated evolution of the pharaohs' obsessive documentation of their dream lives. Smart watches that monitor heart rate variability, apps that analyze sleep stages, and devices that promise to optimize our rest through data collection are modern versions of the elaborate sleep surveillance systems that ancient Egyptian priests used to monitor their rulers' supernatural vulnerability. Historians still argue whether the pharaohs' sleep fears were entirely irrational or reflected genuine insights into the psychological dangers of unconsciousness that modern society has forgotten in our rush to medicalize and optimize every aspect of human experience. The evidence suggests that ancient Egyptians understood something important about the relationship between sleep, vulnerability, and psychological well-being that contemporary culture is only beginning to rediscover. Competitive sleep optimization in modern society mirrors the ancient Egyptian marketplace of supernatural sleep protection, with entrepreneurs offering increasingly expensive and elaborate solutions to sleep problems that may be fundamentally unsolvable through external interventions. The ancient nightmare smiths who crafted protective amulets have been replaced by sleep consultants who sell weighted blankets, white noise machines, and meditation apps. But the underlying promise remains the same: perfect sleep through perfect preparation. The psychological burden of sleep responsibility that crushed ancient pharaohs has been democratized in modern society, where individuals are expected to take personal responsibility for optimizing their sleep through lifestyle modifications, environmental controls, and behavioral interventions. The pressure to achieve perfect sleep has created a new category of performance anxiety that makes restful sleep even more elusive for people who are trying too hard to sleep correctly. Documentation from contemporary sleep clinics reveals patterns of sleep anxiety that would be familiar to ancient Egyptian dream interpreters. Patients who become obsessed with their sleep data, who develop elaborate pre-sleep rituals that must be performed perfectly, and who interpret normal sleep variations as evidence of serious problems are exhibiting behaviors that echo the pharaoh's supernatural sleep paranoia. Cultural transmission of sleep fears occurs through media representations, medical advice, and social expectations that create shared anxieties about sleep that may be more culturally constructed than biologically necessary. Modern sleep culture promotes ideas about optimal sleep that are often as rigid and anxiety-provoking as the ancient Egyptian belief systems that turned rest into a supernatural battlefield. The most profound legacy of pharaonic sleep fears may be the understanding that sleep anxiety often creates the very problems it's designed to solve. Ancient Egyptian rulers who became so afraid of supernatural attacks during sleep that they couldn't rest peacefully were trapped in the same psychological paradox that affects modern insomniacs who worry so much about not sleeping that they can't fall asleep. Emergency interventions for severe sleep disorders in contemporary medicine sometimes involve techniques that would be recognizable to ancient Egyptian physicians: controlled unconsciousness through chemical means, environmental modifications designed to create optimal sleep conditions, and psychological interventions that address the underlying fears and anxieties that prevent natural rest. The tools have evolved, but the fundamental challenges remain remarkably consistent. Training programs for modern sleep specialists include education about the psychological and cultural factors that influence sleep quality, though this training rarely acknowledges the historical precedents for contemporary sleep anxieties. Understanding the Pharaohs' sleep fears might provide valuable insights into why modern sleep interventions often fail to address the deeper psychological issues that create sleep problems. Quality of life improvements from addressing sleep fears, whether ancient or modern, depend more on accepting the fundamental uncertainty and vulnerability of unconsciousness than on perfecting external protective measures. The pharaohs who slept best were probably those who learned to accept their mortality and vulnerability rather than those who developed the most elaborate supernatural defense systems. Psychological research into the relationship between control anxiety and sleep quality suggests that the pharaohs' sleep problems may have been caused less by their supernatural beliefs than by their inability to accept the loss of control that sleep requires. Modern sleep difficulties often stem from similar control issues, suggesting that the fundamental challenge of surrendering to unconsciousness transcends cultural and historical boundaries. The ultimate lesson from pharaonic sleep fears may be that the attempt to eliminate all risk and uncertainty from sleep often creates more problems than it solves. Whether the threats are supernatural demons or modern sleep disorders, the anxiety about sleeping badly often becomes more disruptive than the actual sleep problems themselves, creating self-perpetuating cycles of sleep anxiety that can persist across millennia. As you drift towards sleep tonight, remember that you're participating in the same fundamental human experience that terrified and fascinated the most powerful rulers in ancient history. The pharaohs' elaborate defenses against supernatural threats may seem absurd from our modern perspective, but their underlying fears about vulnerability, mortality, and loss of control during sleep remain as relevant today as they were 3,000 years ago. Perhaps the greatest wisdom from ancient Egypt isn't found in their protective rituals, but in the recognition that sleep requires a kind of courage, the willingness to surrender control and trust in the natural processes that restore our bodies and minds. The soft darkness that surrounds you now has embraced countless generations of sleepers, from terrified pharaohs clutching their protective amulets to modern insomniacs checking their sleep apps one last time. In this moment, you're connected to an unbroken chain of human experience that stretches back to the very beginning of consciousness itself. Let that connection comfort you as your breathing slows, your muscles relax, and your mind begins its own nightly journey through the mysterious realm of dreams. The pharaoh's nightmares have faded into history, but the peace of natural sleep remains eternal, waiting patiently for you to accept its gentle embrace.